At the time of making this video, we're about a month into the single largest land invasion between sovereign nations since World War II. Somehow, Putin has led Russia into an ill-advised war with Ukraine under the pretense of continued Western expansion. For the first time in what seems like aeons, those across the political spectrum seem united in decrying this horrible global circumstance and what was thought impossible in the 21st century. I think the most consistent point I hear and see about the whole ordeal is a sort of stunned, "How did this happen?" Well, a common explanation is simply Putin is insane. And while that may be true, there's a deeper reasoning here which has to do with Russia's fall from the global stage, and most importantly, an age-old pattern in which populists beget authoritarian regimes. Chances are, you, the viewer of this outstanding video, have heard the term populism before. In contemporary discourse, it's kind of a catch-all for generally negative sentiments people hold for public figures that disagree with them. What's more is that the term gets applied to those with diametrically opposed views. So, in America, for example, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have both been labeled populists over their political relevancies. To pull from the absolute wellspring that is Western academia, here's a relatively solid definition from Mood and Kaltwasser. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. This short definition actually gives us a lot to work with. Firstly, populism isn't a strict worldview like liberalism or fascism. It is a mode of discourse which attaches itself to other, more defined ideologies. Secondly, we get the very black and white separation of society. For populists, there are exclusively good people and evil elites, without much of the nuance which actually manifests in the real world. The validity of both of these groups is also unimportant for populism. Finally, we have to consider populism as both a rhetorical strategy and a general mode of political engagement. Essentially, populism is inherently slippery and can be used to describe a great number of different concepts. This is why Hitler and AOC can at once be considered populists. For everyone's favorite Third Reich leader, he was very clear in differentiating the pure Aryan race from the Jewish elite. Spoiler alert, a whole lot of populist rhetoric is just about the Jewish question. While AOC separates the American working class from oligarchs. For me at least, the term itself is neutral, and in using it, context is everything, which brings us to Russia was home to one of the first notable populist groups to earn real power. The Bolsheviks were formed in the late 1800s as a response to the harsh inequality of Tsarist Russia. Their goal was to establish a more pro-worker system. The two groups of the evil Tsar and his supporters and the strong workers are quite clear. After some growing pains, the group succeeded over two successful revolutions in 1917. Then, after an incredibly bloody civil war, the Bolsheviks led by Lenin were able to establish control over Russia and officially form the Soviet Union in 1922. Sadly, the ambition of a worker-led state would never be truly met, and after power struggles following Lenin's death in 1924, the newly formed state would more or less descend into outright authoritarianism. Under Stalin, power was quickly consolidated into the USSR's quickly dwindling ruling board, and they looked from pig to man and man to pig, and there was no difference. Most scholars consider liberal democracy to be a necessary ingredient in the populism stew, as the will of the people cannot be expressed, or at least exploited, if they don't have the right to dictate it. Now, this clearly wouldn't apply to the Union, but that isn't to say elements of populism did not manifest themselves. Many of the iconic propaganda posters of the early to mid-Soviet era demonstrate the key dynamism to Stalin's reign. He was keen on promoting this artificial distinction between the strong worker and the lazy rulers. A great deal of art sanctioned by the Soviet government at this time was incredibly explicit with this contrast. After Old Joe finally kicked the bucket, the USSR government continued to dabble in these notions of the Soviet people and some outsider threat. Whether it was homosexuals or the Jews or whatever people the Union was currently at war with, we continued to see elements of populist rhetoric until the catastrophic collapse of the early 1990s. After half a century of immense outside pressure and imploding internal systems, the USSR would officially disband in 1991. This prompted those with immense financial power from across the globe to swoop in like Beaky Buzzard or Blue Eagle or even the Jungle Book gang. Can you tell there really aren't very many famous vultures in pop culture? And more or less divvy up the freshly depublicized industries from former Soviet states. This brought on the rapid destabilization of the Russian economy as total upheaval wreaked havoc on the nation and its people. Civil war broke out, various West-led initiatives attempted to establish a functioning democracy, and the average Russian citizen was not enjoying a very PogChamp time. It can't be overstated just how traumatic this period was for former Soviet countries. Almost all of them went from at least thinking they were the strongest country in the world to experiencing total societal chaos on all fronts. This was deeply scarring for the average Russian civilian and is incredibly important for understanding the events of today. Now, Boris Yeltsin, the de facto leader of Russia during the mid to late 1990s, was incredibly unpopular, and the Russian populists, who were accustomed to having generally strong, whatever that means, figures at their helm, were itching for some fresh blood to save them from this near decade of chaos and possibly restore Russia or the Union to some of its former glory in their eyes. Almost Randy Orton-like out of nowhere, with a chair, a former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin would be appointed prime minister in 1999. Soon after, Yeltsin would resign unexpectedly, and this fresh face would become the de facto leader of Russia. Ruh-roh.